Welcome back, everybody, for another deep dive. And today we're looking at charitable registration, which is something that every nonprofit in the U.S. has to think about at some point.
Absolutely.
I think most people probably think of those those big, galas and things when they think about fundraising, but it's a lot more complex than that.
It is a lot more complex and a lot more nuanced.
So we have some great information today from Harbor Compliance and Labyrinth, Inc. And then also we have a great resource from the National Association of State Charity Officials, which is also known as NASCO.
NASCO.
So we're going to kind of dive into all this information and figure out, what's the deal with this whole charitable registration thing.
Yeah.
And to start, I think it's really important to actually just define what is charitable solicitation.
Yeah, what is it?
Because it's not as straightforward as it sounds.
No, it is not.
Yeah.
It's not just those big galas or those, fundraising dinners that you think of.
Yeah.
It's a much broader category than that.
Right. So it includes things like grant applications and membership dues, even that little donate now button on your website.
That donate now button can get you in a lot of trouble.
Yeah.
If you're not careful.
If you're not registered to receive those donations.
Exactly.
So yeah, it's definitely more complex than you might think at first glance. And the thing that gets really interesting, I think, is that 41 states require you to register before you can even solicit those donations.
It's a lot. It is a lot. And the thing that gets really tricky is that a lot of people think, okay, I got my federal 501c3 status.
Right.
I'm good to go. But it's the states that regulate charitable solicitation.
Right. And so, how do you even keep track of 41 different states?
I know, it's tough.
That's a lot of paperwork and a lot of different rules and regulations to try to juggle.
Yeah, and they're all different. They all have their own nuances.
Yeah.
They all have their own fees.
Right, so it's not like a one-size-fits-all situation at all.
Not at all.
So, is there any way to kind of simplify this, or are you really just stuck with having to get a lawyer and figure out every single state?
Yeah, it depends on your organization.
Yeah.
I think. There are definitely resources out there to help you figure out what applies to you.
Okay.
And you don't necessarily have to register in all 41 states.
Right.
If you're a smaller organization, maybe you're only operating in a few states,
Right.
You don't have to go crazy and register everywhere.
So it's really about understanding where you're actually fundraising.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Where are your donors coming from?
Right.
Where are you soliciting those donations?
And what about unsolicited donations? So let's say someone just randomly sends a check.
Oh, yeah, that's a good question.
To my organization from a state that I'm not registered in. What's the deal with that?
So that can be a little bit of a gray area.
Okay.
It depends on the state. Some states are stricter than others.
Mm-hmm.
But generally speaking, if you accept and deposit that check and then you start engaging with that donor, you might be triggering registration requirements in that state.
Even though they reached out to you?
Even though it was unsolicited.
Wow. So you really have to be careful.
You do. You have to be really careful. California, for example, is very strict about this. They require registration even for unsolicited donations.
Yeah, I was just going to say, because we're in California.
Yes,
so.
you got to be careful in California.
That's really important for our listeners to know that, even if you're not actively fundraising, if you're a California-based organization and someone sends you money from another state, you've got to be really careful about how you handle that donation.
Yeah, you got to be really strategic about it.
So, what's the takeaway here for nonprofits? What should they be doing to protect themselves?
I think the key is to proceed with caution.
Okay.
If you get an unsolicited donation from another state, definitely reach out to an expert.
Okay.
Or your state charities bureau.
Okay.
Get some guidance before you deposit that check.
Before you do anything.
Before you do anything. Because you don't want to trigger those registration requirements accidentally.
Right. So it's better safe than sorry.
Yeah, better safe than sorry in this case.
So we know now that charitable solicitation is a lot broader than we might initially think.
Yeah.
And that there are all these registration requirements.
Yeah.
And there are a lot of different states that require registration. So what happens if a nonprofit just doesn't comply?
That's a good question.
Yeah.
And a lot of nonprofits, unfortunately, don't comply because it can be so overwhelming.
Right.
But there are risks involved.
Are we talking a slap on the wrist, or are we talking serious?
It can be serious.
Consequences.
Yeah. So there are fines and fees, of course.
Okay.
But it goes beyond that. You can actually damage your reputation.
Oh, wow.
Donors nowadays, they can check state databases.
Oh, really?
To see if you're registered.
Huh.
And if you're not, that could raise some red flags.
Right.
Grant applications can be denied if you're not in good standing.
So we're talking like financial setbacks, loss of credibility with donors.
Exactly.
Potentially even legal trouble.
Potentially legal trouble.
Yeah, so it's not something to be taken lightly.
No, not at all.
Okay, so for those nonprofits that are listening and like, okay, I get it, I need to register, where do they even begin? Like, how do they start navigating this maze of regulations?
That is the million-dollar question, right?
Yeah.
Well, I would say a good starting point is the Charleston Principles.
Okay, and remind me what those are again.
So the Charleston Principles are guidelines that were developed by NASCO back in 2001.
Okay.
And they were really designed to provide some clarity for online fundraising.
Okay.
Because that's where things get really murky.
Right, because like if I have a website, that means I could technically be receiving donations from all 50 states.
Exactly. So the Charleston Principles basically say that if you have a donate button on your website and you're either sending targeted emails to residents of a specific state or you're receiving ongoing donations from that state, you should probably register in that state.
Okay, so it's kind of like if you're doing business there, you should be registered there.
Exactly.
Kind of thing.
Yeah.
Okay. But I'm guessing like even these guidelines aren't perfect.
Unfortunately, no. There are some gray areas.
Okay.
Like, what does ongoing mean? What does substantial mean?
Right.
It's open to interpretation.
It's not like a hard and fast rule.
It's not a hard and fast rule.
Yeah.
And they don't have the force of law in every state.
So you're saying like you can't just like read the Charleston Principles and then be like, oh, okay, I'm good.
Right. You still have to do your research.
Okay.
You still have to consult with an expert.
All right.
Make sure you understand the specific requirements in each state.
Got it. So no shortcuts.
No shortcuts.
All right. So it sounds like you really have to do your homework.
You do. You have to do your homework.
And understand the specific requirements of each state where you're operating. Now, I know we're going to talk more about renewals and those kinds of things in just a bit, but I want to touch on something that I think is actually kind of a positive aspect of charitable registration.
Okay.
And that's disclosure statements.
Yes.
So can you tell us a little bit about what those are and why they're important?
Absolutely. So disclosure statements are all about transparency.
Okay.
25 states require nonprofits to include specific wording on their solicitations.
Okay.
That basically directs donors to information about the organization, its finances, its leadership.
So it's not just about like, following the letter of the law. It's about actually like being transparent and making that information readily available.
Exactly. It's about building trust with your donors.
Right. Because if you see that they're being upfront about things,
yes,
then you're more likely to trust them.
You are.
Right.
And the interesting thing is that studies have actually shown that people donate more when they see these statements.
Really?
Yeah. Transparency breeds confidence, and confidence leads to generosity.
I like that. That's a good takeaway. So where do these statements actually need to appear? Like, what are we talking about?
So any written solicitations like direct mail appeals, email blasts,
okay,
even printed materials like brochures,
got it,
event invitations,
okay,
and of course, your website.
So it's about being consistent.
Yes.
Across the board.
Across all your fundraising channels.
Right. Okay, so we've talked about like state-specific requirements, online fundraising. We've talked about disclosure statements. What about foreign nonprofits that want to fundraise in the U.S.?
Oh, that's a whole other can of worms.
I was going to say, is it like a whole other...
Okay.
Yeah, it's a whole other ballgame.
Ballgame.
They face a lot of unique challenges.
Yeah. So, I mean, like, what do they have to do?
Well, they usually have to create a U.S.-based Friends of nonprofit.
Okay.
And this separate entity can handle the registration process.
Got it.
And comply with all the relevant state and federal regulations.
So it's like they're creating a subsidiary
exactly.
that's specifically designed for
fundraising in the States, for fundraising in the U.S.
Yeah.
Okay, so, I mean, but even with that in place, I imagine there's still a lot to navigate.
There is. There's still a lot to navigate. They still need to understand the specific requirements in each state where they intend to fundraise.
Right, because every state is different.
Every state is different.
Yeah.
Different fees, different forms, different deadlines.
Yeah, it's just mind-boggling to me how it's not like, more standardized across the board.
I know it would be so much easier if it was.
Yeah.
But unfortunately, it's not.
All right. Well, I think we've covered a lot of ground in this first part of our deep dive, and we've learned that charitable registration is definitely more complicated than it might seem at first glance.
Definitely.
But we're going to take a quick break, and when we come back, we're going to delve deeper into some of the specific challenges and strategies for staying in compliance.
Sounds good.
All right, so we're back and we're going to keep digging into this whole charitable registration thing. And one thing that I know a lot of nonprofits struggle with is renewals.
Renewals. Yeah, those are fun.
Yeah, I bet.
Yeah.
So what makes them so tricky?
Well, first of all, you got to remember that it's not a one-time thing.
Right.
You got to keep it up.
You got to maintain it.
You got to maintain your registration.
Right.
And every state has a different process, different deadlines, different forms. It's a lot to keep track of.
And I imagine if you miss a deadline,
Oh, yeah.
there are some pretty serious consequences.
There can be. Yeah, you could face late fees.
Okay.
You could lose your registration status.
Wow.
You might even face legal action in some states.
So it's not something to mess around with.
Not at all.
So how can nonprofits stay on top of this and avoid those compliance nightmares?
Well, I think the biggest thing is to have a system,
Okay.
whether it's a simple spreadsheet,
Okay.
a calendar, some kind of software
Right.
that helps you keep track of all those deadlines.
Okay, so designate somebody
Yes.
to be in charge of that.
Have a point person, a compliance champion.
I like that, a compliance champion.
They can be the one who makes sure everything's filed on time.
So you don't have to do it all manually.
No,
Okay, good.
there's technology out there that can help.
That's good to hear.
And don't be afraid to reach out to your state charities bureau if you have questions.
Oh, that's a good point.
They're usually happy to help.
Right.
They want you to succeed.
It's not like they're trying to trick you or anything.
You know, they want you to be in compliance.
Right. Okay. So let's talk about online fundraising again, because I think that's where things can get really complicated.
Yeah, online fundraising, that's a whole other beast.
Because, like we said earlier, if you have a website,
Yeah,
you could potentially be receiving donations from all over the world.
from anywhere, yeah.
So how do you even know, which states you need to be registered in?
Well, one option is to go all in and register in all 41 states that require it.
Okay.
That gives you maximum coverage,
Right.
but it's expensive.
Right. And a lot of nonprofits don't have the resources to do that.
Yeah.
Exactly. So for most organizations, that's not really feasible.
So is there a more realistic approach?
I think so.
Yeah.
Yeah, you can focus on the states where you're most actively fundraising,
Okay.
where you have the most donors.
So it's about kind of prioritizing.
It's about prioritizing, and
Yeah.
being strategic.
Okay.
You can also mitigate risk by being transparent on your website.
Okay.
You can say, we're registered in these states. We're not soliciting donations from these states.
Let's just be upfront about it.
Be upfront about it, and then people know what to expect.
Okay. What about disclosure statements?
Oh, yeah. Disclosure statements are still important online.
Okay.
You need to make sure that information's easily accessible.
Right. So don't bury it somewhere on your website.
Don't bury it. Yeah.
Yeah.
Put a link to your full disclosure statement on
Yeah.
your donation page, or incorporate key elements of the statement into the donation process.
So it's all about making it easy for the donor.
Exactly. Transparency is key. Okay, so we've talked about state-specific requirements, online fundraising renewals, disclosure statements. Is there anything else that we haven't touched on that's important for nonprofits to keep in mind?
Well, I think the biggest thing is just to stay informed.
Okay.
This whole world of charitable registration is constantly evolving.
So you can't just learn it once and then be done.
Exactly. You got to stay up to date.
Keep learning.
Keep learning. Yeah.
Subscribe to newsletters.
Subscribe to newsletters, attend webinars,
Talk to other nonprofits.
network with other nonprofits.
Okay, so stay in the loop.
Stay in the loop, yeah.
Okay, and what about technology? Are there any ways that technology is changing the landscape of charitable registration?
Absolutely. More and more states are moving towards online filing systems,
Oh, that's good.
electronic submissions.
Makes it easier.
It makes it easier.
Yeah.
Yeah, you don't have to deal with all the paperwork.
So less time spent on paperwork, more time spent on your mission.
Exactly.
Okay. And there are also software tools available that can help with compliance.
Yes, definitely.
So it sounds like technology is becoming an increasingly important part of this whole equation.
It is. It's making compliance more manageable,
Okay, good.
more efficient.
All right, so as we kind of wrap up this part of our deep dive, what's the one key takeaway you want our listeners to remember about charitable registration?
I would say the most important thing is to remember that compliance is an ongoing process.
Okay.
It's not a one-time thing.
It's a journey.
It's a journey.
Yeah.
Yeah, you got to be proactive. You got to stay informed. You got to build a culture of compliance within your organization.
So it's not just about checking boxes.
No.
It's about really integrating it.
It's about integrating it into your operations,
Okay.
making it part of your DNA.
All right. Well, that's some great advice, I think. And, it might seem daunting at first, but I think if you take it step by step and you use the resources that are available,
Yeah,
it's definitely manageable.
it is manageable.
Okay. So when we come back in part 3, we're actually going to talk about how compliance can be a strategic advantage for nonprofits.
Oh, yeah, that's a good one.
So stay tuned. All right, so we're back for the final part of our deep dive on charitable registration. And, we've talked about why it's important and how to do it. But now I want to shift gears a little bit.
Yep.
What if instead of seeing compliance as like this big burden, we saw it as an opportunity?
I like that. Yeah, I think that's a really important mindset shift. Because compliance, when it's done well, can actually be a strategic advantage.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Tell me more.
Well, think about it from a donor's perspective. They want to give to organizations that they trust.
Right.
Organizations that are transparent and accountable.
So if you can show them that you're taking compliance seriously,
Exactly.
that builds trust.
It does. It shows that you're responsible, that you're a good steward of their donations.
Right. So it's not just about like avoiding getting in trouble.
No, it's about actually building a stronger organization.
Okay, so how can nonprofits go beyond just like checking the boxes
What?
and actually use compliance to their advantage?
Well, one way is to really highlight your commitment to compliance in your communications. Okay.
Okay.
So talk about it in your annual report on your website,
Uh-huh.
in your fundraising appeals.
So be proactive about it.
Be proactive.
Yeah.
Yeah. Don't be afraid to toot your own horn a little bit.
Right, because it's something to be proud of.
It is.
You did it right.
Another thing you can do is really use compliance to differentiate yourself.
Okay.
In a crowded nonprofit landscape,
Uh-huh.
it can really make you stand out if you can show that you're going above and beyond.
Right, because donors have a lot of choices.
You do. They have a lot of choices.
So you have to give them a reason to choose you.
Exactly.
Okay, so it's
Yeah.
kind of like a badge of honor.
It is. It's like a seal of approval.
Right, that says you're trustworthy and you're a good investment.
Exactly. And it's not just about attracting donors.
Okay.
It can also help you with grant makers.
Oh, interesting.
A lot of foundations and corporations, they require grantees to meet certain compliance standards.
So if you can show them that you're already doing that.
Yeah, you're already ahead of the game.
Okay, so it can actually open doors to new funding opportunities.
Absolutely. It can really give you a competitive edge.
Wow. So it seems like there are a lot of benefits to embracing compliance.
There are a lot of benefits, yeah.
Beyond just, avoiding fines and fees.
It's not just about avoiding the negative.
Right.
It's about actually creating something positive.
Okay, so what other upsides are there to compliance?
Well, one thing that's often overlooked is that it can actually improve your internal operations.
Oh, okay.
By putting compliance systems in place,
Mm-hmm.
you're basically creating a framework for good governance and financial management.
So it's not just about like external requirements, it's about actually strengthening your organization from the inside out.
Exactly. It's about creating a culture of accountability and transparency.
Okay, so as we kind of wrap up this whole deep dive, I'm curious to hear your thoughts on the future of charitable registration. What trends do you see on the horizon?
Well, one trend that's definitely already happening is the increasing use of technology. We're seeing more online filing systems, electronic submissions, software tools that can help automate compliance tasks.
So it's making things easier for nonprofits.
It's making things easier, less paperwork, more efficiency.
Okay. And what about like the overall landscape? Is there anything else that nonprofits should be prepared for?
I think the biggest thing is just this ongoing emphasis on transparency and accountability.
Yeah.
Donors are becoming more discerning.
Right.
They want to know how their money's being used,
Uh-huh.
and they expect organizations to be upfront about their operations.
So it's not enough to just follow the rules. You have to actually be able to show that you're following the rules.
Exactly. You have to be able to demonstrate your commitment to compliance.
Okay, so as we resurface from our deep dive into charitable registration, what are like the 3 key takeaways you want our listeners to remember?
Okay, so number 1, compliance is essential.
Okay.
It's about protecting your organization, building trust, and ensuring that you can actually achieve your mission.
Okay, number 2.
Number 2, compliance doesn't have to be a burden. It can actually be a strategic advantage if you approach it the right way.
And number 3.
Number 3, you're not alone.
Okay.
There's a whole community of nonprofits out there, and there are resources available to help you.
I like that. All right, well, thanks for walking us through this whole complex topic. I think we all learned a lot today.
My pleasure. It was great to be here.
And to our listeners, thanks for joining us on this deep dive. Until next time, keep diving deep and stay curious.